Good morning, everyone. This is André Fauteux. I'm editor and publisher of 21st Century Housing magazine based in Quebec. And this morning, I'm very, very happy to have Dr. Linda Birnbaum with us once again. Good morning, Dr. Birnbaum.
Good morning, Andre. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for taking the time once again. It's our second interview. Just a reminder, you are the former director of the National Environmental Health Sciences Agency in the United States. You were there for how many years?
Well, the name of the agency is actually part of the National Institutes of Health. So it's the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And I was the director for almost 11 years.
Yes, and you were director when the NTP published that famous study on rats exposed to cell phone radiation. The hypothesis was that it did not cause cancer, and the study did prove that the types of tumors that were caused, these schwannomas attacking the myelin, which insulates our nerves or rat nerves, are the same types of tumors that we see in some human long-term users of cell phones. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct. The cardiac schwannomas are parallel to the acoustic neuromas that are seen in people. And really the difference is that we couldn't put a cell phone on the ears of a rat or a mouse for that matter. And so that they were exposed whole body. And we had calculated that the heart area would be a likely target for radiation if it were to cause effect. So we were not surprised that that was one of the target tissues.
I was surprised to see that a heart cancer exists.
Well, it's really the nerves, the lining of the nerves around the heart, but we did see a lot of pathology in the hearts as well, non-cancer pathology.
Now, of course, the skeptics will say that rats are not humans and that the rats were very highly exposed, that we cannot extrapolate to the exposure of humans. And you wrote an article recently that I'd like to show to our viewers, where you were responding to the UK Million Women study. Can you please explain what you were writing about?
Yeah, well, this was a paper that came out which really did not have adequate measures of exposure of the women, either in time, how long they use phones or how many hours a day they use phones, for example. It really did not address the issue adequately. I think that was the main thing for this article.
And of course, we're seeing that radiofrequency radiation can induce oxidative stress, which may be one cause of cancer long down the road. But just to backtrack and talk about the politics, countries such as France ban Wi-Fi in daycares, and they limit the use of Wi-Fi in primary school. Now we're seeing that New Hampshire wants to limit cell phone towers installation up to 500 meters away from homes. Is that exaggerated, such actions? Are they science-based?
I'm going to have a hard time responding to that directly. I have more expertise really with, say, cell phone radiation, where you're holding the phone by your ears. I think there is growing data that the cell phone towers may be problematic, at least for some people. I think we need to understand that there's a great range in susceptibility that people have to various stressors, with non-ionizing radiation being one of them. But it's clear, I believe, from the human data, from some of the case control work, those are the human studies, as well as the animal studies, that there is the potential for cell phone radiation to cause an increase in tumors as well as non-cancer effects, at least in some people.
So some people, of course, are more susceptible to disease. There may be a genetic predisposition, and then environmental pollution, your water, your air, your food. but I'm in contact with a lot of scientists over 30 years, such as Dr. Bill Ray of the Environmental Health Center, who's telling me that concussions, carbon monoxide, pesticides, mold, things like that, uh, even heavy metals and metal implants can make people more susceptible to chemical and electrical pollution. Have you heard of that?
Well, I think the issue is we tend to evaluate one chemical or one stressor, in this case, say radiofrequency radiation at a time, but no one is exposed to one stressor at a time. And
Exactly.
when we start looking, we do see that there's interactions. So, for example, certain metals, certain pesticides can cause oxidative stress and oxidative damage. If radiation is also doing that, and there's growing evidence that it may, then you could have certainly an additive, if not a synergistic effect of the multiple exposures.
Yeah, and it's impossible to calculate the multiplication of risk with several substances.
Well, we can try, but we're not very good at it. We have different statistical models that can try to separate out those effects, but it's when everyone is exposed. So some of the concerns that people who are not sure that the animal data is relevant to humans has to do with the fact that the incidence of, say, the brain tumors or the schwannomas was low in the population of animals that were tested. It was, I think, 3 to 5%. But when you have 6 billion people using cell phones, that's a lot of people that might be impacted.
Mm-hmm. So why we're not seeing gliomas, the incidence exploding all over the place?
Well, I think there is some data from France showing an increase in highly malignant brain tumors of the glioblastomas in France. I think sometimes it may depend on how you look at it. How do you cut those tumors? Do you cut them, into all brain tumors? Do you cut them into non-malignant tumors? Do you look at specific types? I think the data is building. Now, I don't know how it is in Canada, but I would say in the US, no one was using cell phones, or almost no one, before 2000. And I think even by the mid 2000s, people were just starting to increase their use. Now, today, everyone essentially uses mobile devices, but at least for cell phones and for other kinds of devices, it's often easy to reduce your exposure because the radiation goes down as a function of the square or the distance, which means that if you don't hold your phone right by your head, your radiation level goes way down. From my point of view, that's an easy thing to do. So I try never to use my cell phone held up to my head. I always try to use, Bluetooth or earbuds or just a speaker if I'm in a place where I can turn on the speaker. And I think the same thing is true for many of our other devices. Keep it further away from your body. That will help reduce any risk.
Well, of course, that was one question I was going to ask you. Do you use Wi-Fi and cordless phones 24/7 at home?
We still have some old fashioned plug in phones, but um, we do use we do use some cordless phones, although we use them very little today because almost everything is on the cell phone. And as I said, with the cell phone, we almost always don't put it up to our head. It's either depending where I am and where I'm going, it's earbuds, it's Bluetooth, it's speaker.
But what about landlines? Have you canceled those?
I still have a landline, but we don't use it very much. We kind of have kept it around. I think it's just people in my age range, that's what we're used to. We have a lot of contacts or bills or so on that are all tied into the landline number. So we have not canceled it. But I know none of my children have landlines anymore.
Most people have canceled them.
Yeah.
How about Wi-Fi and cordless phones in your bedroom? Is that something you want for your grandchildren?
We don't have cord. I mean, we keep, when I go to bed at night, my cell phone sits in the kitchen. being charged. We don't keep them, you know, for example, on the bedside or near our, you know, anywhere near our bodies.
Away from the body.
Yeah.
And how about Wi-Fi? Do you shut it off at night?
No, we do not do that. Now that may be something we should consider, but I will say I'm a pragmatist. I do what I can do that's easy, that I believe may be helpful. So I think by keeping, from, in my case, by keeping the cell phones away from my body, you know, not holding things up to my head, I minimize the risk.
And is your Wi-Fi router in your bedroom?
No,
Is
no,
that
the Wi-Fi
you want to avoid?
the Wi-Fi router is as far away from it's in the corner in the basement.
So it's still the factor of the square of the distance. The radiation goes way down.
That is correct, and I feel that that's a pretty safe place for it to be, as opposed to having it anywhere near our bodies.
But how? Let's go back to the French national legislation banning Wi-Fi in daycare. Is that exaggerated?
I don't know. You know, I think our children have too much screen time. You know, looking even at my grandchildren or looking at other people's kids are walking around, little kids, and I mean really little kids. You know, if you're at a restaurant, you'll see the little kid, the 3 or 4 year old, sitting there scrolling through the pictures on the phone because it keeps them quiet. It's something to do. Do I think this is great? I'm not sure. So I think that limiting exposure in young children is a reasonable idea. You know, we do know, for example, that the bones of the head, the skull, is thinner in young children, so that the radiation will be able to travel further. So, you know, again, I don't really know the answer, but I would like to see less exposure to little kids. I think that would be, again, a pragmatic position.
Mm-hmm. I had a Scottish coach when I played soccer as a kid, and he always said, when in doubt, kick it out.
Well, you know, we say the same kinds of things, whether it's different kinds of exposures, you know, if you don't do it, if you have a concern.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, to me, I think that some of the concern related to things that you hold close to your body or close to your head are concerning. I'll tell you, if I'm walking around and occasionally I'll see some of my girls put a cell phone in their shirt as a place to hold it, and I immediately jump on it and say, don't do that. Because why take the risk?
Yeah. You mentioned the year 2000. 2 decades is not very long when you look at cancer data. I realized, though, back then, speaking to Ole Johansson and other Swedish scientists, that in 2000, Scandinavians were the first population of the world where half the population used cell phones. So they're a bit ahead of us. And I met Dr. Leonard Hardell in Brussels in 2015, who did most of the epidemiological studies on brain cancer and cell phone use. And he told me that since the late 70s, he did a lot of research on dioxin.
Yes, he did.
PCBs and Roundup, glyphosate. And he was always right when he was waving the red flag saying, whoop, Houston, we may have a problem here. In terms of I know IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, highly based its classification of RFs as possibly carcinogenic in 2011 on his studies and others. But what I realize is that very few countries have good cancer brain tumor registries, specifically looking at glioblastomas. Even in Canada, we're just starting in Calgary, Alberta. They're saying, whoops, it seems that these types, the most deadliest form of the brain cancers, are going up. But so far, we don't have enough data. But there are indications in a few countries, as you said, as France. So do you think North American and other countries should implement more precautionary measures?
Well, I would like to see first of all, I am a believer in being cautious when there are options. And as I've said, with the cell phones, there are easy options. Just don't hold it up to your head. Or if for some reason you have to hold it to your head, if you just take your hands and kind of put your fingers to separate where you're holding the phone so it's just a little further away, that will decrease your risk. Also, for example, if it's hard to find a signal, then there's a lot more energy being used. So, wait till you're in a better location to try. I think the point that you make about Scandinavia being kind of among the first adopters of cell phones is important because, yes, in Scandinavia, the phones were used, but, here in the US, I don't think I had a cell phone. And of course, when I got one, it was one of those little flip phones that we used to have until maybe 2004, 2005. So studies, and I don't know like whether in Canada was probably kind of similar to the US. Maybe the UK was kind of similar too. I just am not sure. But I think it's important to allow for the fact that cancer isn't instantaneous, that there's always a latency. And from the time that you have the exposure, it could take 10 years, 20 years, 40 years for the cancers to become evident.
I know a nurse who worked in neurosurgery in Montreal, and she's trying to get surgeons to talk about it. There are very few in the world, but they are seeing in hospitals more and more young people with these types of schwannomas, tumors of the nerves in the ear and the head, in the jaw, the salivary glands.
Right.
Are you hearing reports of that?
I have not, but frankly, I haven't looked for that very much. I think there needs to be more investigation. They've been that kind of tumor has been extremely rare.
Yeah.
And so it's hard, sometimes it's hard to find good records of what it used to be compared to what you might be seeing now. So I think we need some of the studies that are prospective going forward. But to me, there's enough data out there to exercise caution.
Right. How about cell towers? The Ramazzini Institute did a similar study to yours at the US NTP, exposing rats, but this time to lower exposure, mimicking exposure to cell towers, and they found the same types of schwannomas of the heart and oxidative or DNA damage and things like that. So what does that mean for humans? Because when I asked the Quebec Institute of Public Health, about the symptoms that the military experienced in the 50s and 60s and 70s, their answer was, well, people today are not as exposed. But some scientists are saying, yeah, they are exposed because it's 24/7 and they can be right up close to the router 24/7. But do you believe some people are really experiencing symptoms from towers?
So I'm not sure, but I do know that there are people who are extremely sensitive. And I don't think there's any way a priori to understand who's going to be sensitive. So it's just like I do believe the data supports that there are some people who have something called multiple chemical sensitivity and are extremely sensitive to chemicals. I think there are also people who are extremely sensitive to different frequencies of radiation.
That's what Dr. Rate and other scientists have found in the field, that he did a study really double blind where they're exposed, and they found a fraction of the patients were specifically sensitive to specific frequencies,
right,
and they could replicate the exposure and the symptoms. There are very, very few of those studies out there. Of course, during the pandemic, there still is so much disinformation about the dangers of all sorts of substances. But I don't know if you know Paul Leroux. Paul is a physicist who teaches the toxicology of electromagnetic fields at McGill University in Montreal to med school students. And he was on the New Hampshire Commission studying 5G, which led to that state being the first to want to adopt legislation next year. limiting people's exposure to cell towers. But a lot of these scientists are being associated to the conspiracy theorists. What's your take on that? Can we talk about the possible 5G without being blackballed, you know?
Well, we should be able to talk about it. I think many people don't understand that 5G includes 2G, 3G, 4G. It's not just one specific new wavelength that's being used. It's a very inclusive, put it that way. I think I wouldn't call someone like Paul a conspiracy theorist. I'd say he's a scientist who at this point has a view that is, people are just really now beginning to look at it. So I think that I'm not convinced either way, but I know that there have been people concerned with cell phone towers for 20 years or more. The data is not, I would still say the data is not fully clear. But if I were going house hunting, I probably would not buy a home right next to a cell phone tower.
I think it's the fact that homes are being devalued also, perceived risk or real risk. But right. I saw, there's condos in San Francisco, and then they put a little cell, a small cell tower. It's like a suitcase actually on a lamp pole a few feet from a window, and the $3 million condo value goes down 20%. That may wake people up.
Yeah, no, I think we just don't know, frankly. But again, I would remember or remind us all to think about that the danger kind of goes down as the distance increases. So I wouldn't want it attached to my house. But if it's a certain distance away, maybe it's not a problem. I think we need some really well done prospective studies to address this issue.
Yeah. 5G, just to explain to people, it's going to use all sorts of frequencies, 3 types of levels. I think above 700 megahertz, but more and more above 10 gigahertz. And so it's very focused, but these beams, they're going to shoot directly to your cell phone. But what I'm told is that it can heat your skin or harm your eyes if you get it directly. And what scientists, really top scientists such as Igor Belayev, trained in Moscow, teaches in Stockholm, and leads the Bratislava radio protection lab, was telling me that, yes, 5G radiation does not penetrate fully, very deep, but you have sweat ducts, of course, in the skin that connect to other organs, and also the the acupuncture points also, which makes him worried. And also, there are about 100 studies, I'm told, on very high frequency above 10 gigahertz, and they are worrisome enough to not want one of these small cell antennas right outside your window.
Yeah. Again, I'm not an expert in that, but I think we need further study to explore that. And if there's credible information that really shows that there is a problem or really could be a problem, then I would rather see us try to be protected.
Mm-hmm. So what websites do you refer to? I did see the California Public Health Department has an advisory on cell phone safety. What other websites do you recommend?
Well, I just read whatever comes out, and I work very closely with some of the people in Environmental Health Trust that pulls together a lot of the literature on this, and that's what I tend to do, and Obviously, I'm on a bunch of listservs where, whenever a new paper comes out, it appears in my on my computer to take a look at.
Yeah, the Environmental Health Trust is one of the sites I follow, notably for the policies adopted around the world.
Correct, and I think overall there aren't many. In the U.S., the fact that the National Toxicology Program's cell phone study, which was the largest study of its kind ever done, and it was done beautifully and very well, didn't do anything. That it was just largely ignored by the regulatory agencies. Um, they would make the comment, well, rats or mice are not people, but I think we all need to remember that people are a kind of animal. And just like rats and mice may have some susceptible members of their species, I think it's likely that there are some susceptible members of the human species. And I also think that we have such differential exposure that goes on. So people, some people may talk on the phone the way that I do, never holding it up to my head. Other people may hold it up to their ears for hours and hours and hours and hours. That's very different exposure that goes on. Mm-hmm. And I think if you think that it's better if you have evidence that something is problematic, then please try to reduce your levels of exposure. I should say the National Toxicology Program, which I was also director of, is continuing to look at some of the effects that have been seen in the rodent studies and do molecular studies comparing the tumors that they saw in the rodent species with tumors that have been reported in people, and see if there are similar molecular and biochemical processes going on at the cellular level. And I think those studies will be very informative.
Mm-hmm. I think there are now 5 or 6 cell phone rat cancer studies positive going back to the military. And a lot of scientists are saying that IARC should classify cell phone radiation, all radio frequencies, class 1 carcinogens, if not at least 2A, probably like Roundup, glyphosate. What's your take?
Well, I think there is enough data. If you look at the criteria that IARC is supposed to use, if there is adequate animal data and there is suspicious human data, then it would that would put it in the category of a 2A, a probable human carcinogen. Really, to get to known human carcinogen or the class 1, you really need good human data, good animal data, and then you need mechanistic data as well. Actually, you could, without great human data, if you have really good animal data, which we have, and you had good mechanistic data, and you had some human data, that could bump it up to the known human carcinogen or the class 1 category. But I think there's enough data to move it from possible to probable.
The probable, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, the mechanisms are still a problem, but there are a lot of good hypotheses out there, like melatonin reduction and other oxidative stress.
Yeah, well, I think oxidative stress is a big one. There's a whole new approach that's being used for classification of, or kind of mechanistic understanding of cancer, and it's called the key characteristics of cancer. And I forget if there are 10 or 12 of them. And you don't have to show you have every one, but if you have a number of them, it's highly likely that this kind of exposure can be associated with a cancer response.
They are adding up for RFs. What about the fact that cells will become inundated with calcium when they're reacting to protecting themselves from the radiation?
So I believe that may fall into one of the key characteristics. Cells and our whole bodies are fairly good at maintaining kind of homeostasis, but you can exceed the challenge can cause you to lose that condition. And of course, that puts points up again the kind of increased risk to young children, where where their bodies are constantly developing and growing and differentiating, which means that they are more sensitive to whether it's a chemical stressor or a radiation stressor or a heat stressor or noise, a number of things, just because of where they are in their lifetime.
Yeah, and it's not about just cancer, it's about cell communication, so your whole body's balance and normal functioning. For children who are growing up and developing, it's a challenge if your cells aren't communicating right.
Right.
Lastly, just to close on, about IARC, Anthony B. Miller, who was head of epidemiology at the National Cancer Institute in Toronto for 15 years, who's over 90 today. He was an IARC advisor for many years. He told me that IARC was really independent of the World Health Organization, which is more politicized. But are you worried that now that's changing, that people who are looking at the data of the RF toxicity are people who have been linked to studies financed by industry?
That always concerns me, whatever the stressor is that that's concerned about. I feel that when IARC convenes panels, almost all of them have been very unconflicted. I sure hope that doesn't change going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope so. It's not the echoes that I'm getting from a lot of people.
Well, I've heard some of the same, and at the Collegium Ramazzini meeting, which occurred starting Thursday in Carpi, and this is an honorary organization of occupational and environmental specialists, both physicians and non-physicians. There was a whole session on Thursday morning about electromagnetic radiation and radiofrequency radiation, and there was a great deal of concern raised about this and the fact that something needs to be done. And there was the concern that there were some people at IARC who didn't think it was a problem and might be too closely linked to ICNIRP, the organization that is pretty highly conflicted because of its relationships with with industry. So I think that there is concern out there. Some former members of IARC who actually work for IARC, not only people who participate in the meeting, did raise that concern. So I think it's appropriate that we as scientists continue to push IARC to maintain its really very unconflicted status. Now, I do know, because I've participated in some IARC meetings, that usually people who, for example, are consulting for industry or actually work for industry cannot be actual members of the committee that does the evaluation. They can be there as observers, they're allowed to make comments, but they are not allowed actually in the decision-making processes. And I certainly hope that doesn't stop.
Yeah, well, I heard, Mary Fishking and others who have always been linked to negative studies finding no effect of EMFs is sitting on that committee right now. And people should know that the World Health Organization's EMF research project was founded by a former Health Canada scientist, Michael Repicoli, who was a very well-known industry consultant who created ICNIRP, which is the infamous agency whose radiation exposure limits have been adopted by most countries, which only considers the heating effect as being dangerous. Just in closing, the American Academy of Pediatrics many years ago said we have to get away from these thermal limits and adopt non-thermal limits of exposure to non-ionizing radiation to protect children and other sensitive people. What do you think of that proposition?
Well, I support it. AAP is a very forward-looking medical society which has expressed their concerns about numerous kinds of environmental exposures, which are often, let's just say, played down or ignored by many in the medical and in the public health community.
Is it being discussed in the mainstream medical community, or are they not informed?
I think they're fairly uninformed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is general resistance to the idea, you know, and maybe this is going to sound too simplistic, but I think physicians are looking to see something in their patients that they can directly link to like an infectious agent. And when you're talking about something which is hard to measure, there's no smoking gun, it's harder, I think, often for them to accept. I tried to remind some of my physician friends that no one's ever done a double-blind control study on lead, and yet the consensus in the scientific community today is there's no safe level of exposure to lead. You know, we know high levels clearly are toxic. Same thing with tobacco. We've never had a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled smoking. And yet we know that smoking is bad and it's associated with a bunch of effects. Sometimes it just takes time for the data to build before people are aware of it. But I think just like in the tobacco industry where you have active industry opposition and much of it cloaked as science, I think we're seeing that in the radiation frequency literature as well as many other areas.
And unfortunately, medical school students are not trained to take a good environmental exposure. I forget the term, but ask their patients about mold and chemical and radiation exposure.
No, I mean, I think that's
the history.
Yeah, and that's all driven by what's on the electronic medical records and the questions they have to ask today. So if the question isn't on that form, it's likely not to be asked. And the other issue really is that in training of clinicians, whether they're, you know, MDs or ODs or nurse practitioners or anything like that, their training in environmental sciences is practically non-existent, and in many cases totally non-existent.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope that senior scientists, independent, retired people such as you are going to rise more interest in people who are in the field and look at these things that are really marginal, it seems, in mainstream medicine. So Linda Birnbaum, former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in the US. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure speaking to you.
You too, André. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye now. Have a great day.